She kissed me before she answered. That's the part I keep coming back to. I asked a question, a simple one, the kind you ask when you finally run out of reasons not to, and she crossed 3 feet of hallway and kissed me instead of speaking. Her hands were shaking, not mine. Hers, and in that moment I didn't know any of what I was about to learn. I didn't know about the notebook, or the lease clause, or what was on that laptop. All I knew was that a woman who had been watching me from her window for 31 days had just kissed me in a corridor that smelled like old wood and someone else's rosemary, and whatever she'd been looking for, I think she decided I might be it. Let me start where it actually starts. I moved into the Kellner building on a gray Tuesday in March, with 2 duffel bags, a portfolio case, and a box of kitchen things I hadn't fully unpacked from my last place. I'm a graphic designer, freelance, which means I work from home, which means the apartment matters more than it does for most people. I need quiet. I need a window with decent light. I need walls that don't feel like they're narrowing. The Kellner had all 3, and it was inside my budget, and the building super, a man named Gus who wore the same flannel shirt every time I saw him, seemed like the kind of person who'd fix the radiator without being asked 3 times. I signed the lease. 3rd week of March. 2nd floor, Unit 2B. Courtyard facing side. The courtyard was what sold me, honestly. It was small, maybe 40 feet by 30, with 2 stone benches and a pair of birch trees that had started to bud. You could hear the street from it, but just barely, like the building absorbed the noise at the entrance and only let the softer remainder through. It was the kind of space a city pretends not to have. I started cutting through it every morning on the way to the coffee shop 2 blocks east, and every evening on the way back. It became a ritual fast, the way small routines do when you're resetting a life in a new place. Hat on. Coffee from the corner shop 2 blocks east. Through the courtyard. Right out the building's south gate. 38 days of this, more or less identical, before anything changed. I didn't notice the window until the 2nd week. 3rd floor. The apartment directly above and slightly to the left of the courtyard center. The window faced down at an angle that gave whoever was inside a clean view of both benches and the path between them, which was always my path. I noticed it the way you notice something peripheral, a sensation before a fact. The feeling of being observed arrives before the evidence does. I'd look up and the window would be empty, or I'd think I'd caught movement and convince myself it was the light catching the glass, or a curtain, or nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. I kept walking. I poured my coffee. I went to work. By the 3rd week, I had stopped telling myself anything, and had simply begun to be aware of the window the way you're aware of a particular sound in an old building, not alarmed, just attuned to it. When I crossed the courtyard in the morning, I'd glance up for half a second before I could stop myself. Sometimes the window was dark. Sometimes there was a shape, pulled back from the glass, not quite visible. Once, on a Wednesday morning when the light was flat and gray and the birch trees were still bare, I looked up and the shape was closer than usual. Close enough that I thought I could make out a face, and then I was through the courtyard door and out on the street, and I spent the next hour at the coffee shop wondering what I was supposed to do with any of that. I didn't have an answer, so I did what most people do with something they can't explain and can't stop thinking about. I did nothing. For another full week, I did nothing. It was Gus who gave her a name. I was checking the mail, late on a Friday afternoon, the lobby still warm with someone's takeout, when he came through with a bucket and a mop, muttering about the leak in 3F that still hadn't been properly reported. He said it the way people say things they've said before, to no one in particular, a private frustration that had escaped into the air. 3F, Third floor, courtyard side. I said, "Who lives in 3F?" He looked at me like I'd asked what color the walls were. "Nadia," he said. "She's been here 2 years. Quiet. Keeps to herself. Does something on a computer." He moved on with his bucket. I stood at the mailboxes a moment longer than necessary. Nadia. She had a name now. She'd had one before, of course. Everyone does, whether you know it or not. But now I knew it. And knowing it changed something subtle about the window. Made it more real. Less a trick of attention. More a fact. Someone lived up there. Someone named Nadia sat at a table near her third-floor window and watched the courtyard, and for 22 days I had been the thing in the courtyard worth watching. Or one of the things. I didn't know yet that there were others. I didn't go up to introduce myself. I spent the entire weekend thinking about it and decided against it, on the grounds that there was no version of the knock and hello that didn't begin with "I noticed you watching me," which felt like precisely the wrong foot. I let another week pass. I kept crossing the courtyard. I kept glancing up. The shape in the window continued to appear, mornings mostly, and some evenings. And once, on a Tuesday when rain had driven everyone else inside, I stopped completely in the middle of the path and looked directly up at the window, and she didn't move. We were looking at each other across 30 feet of wet air for what must have been 5 seconds. Then I walked on. My heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the cold, and I knew it, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I went upstairs and made dinner. That night I decided that whatever this was, I was going to have to say something. I gave myself until the end of the week. The week ended on Friday. On Saturday morning I was in the courtyard at 7:15, coffee in hand, and I stopped at the foot of the birch trees and looked up at 3F, and she was there, closer to the glass than usual, and I raised my hand. Not a wave, not quite. More of an acknowledgement, a small, deliberate signal that I saw her, and I was choosing to make that known instead of pretending otherwise. And she raised hers. 1 second. Then she stepped back from the window and disappeared. I stood there in the cold with my coffee and thought, I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected her to raise her hand back. I went up on Sunday. 3rd floor. The corridor was narrow and smelled like old wood and something faintly herbal, rosemary maybe, escaping from somewhere behind a door. Her door was at the end, 3F, with a small brass number that was slightly crooked, and a mat that said nothing, just a plain gray rectangle. I stood at it longer than I needed to, rearranging my opening sentence 3 times, and then I knocked before I could rearrange it a 4th. She opened the door and looked at me, and the first thing I thought was that she was younger than I'd expected and more tired. 30, maybe 31. With dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation and everything to do with focus. The mark of someone who'd been paying very close attention to something stressful for a very long time. She was holding a pencil, not a pen. A pencil with a worn-down eraser that looked like it had been doing real work. I said, "You've been watching me from your window." It wasn't the line I'd planned. I'd rehearsed something neighborly and social, some version of "Hi, I'm Daniel." I just moved in downstairs, and what came out instead was this, the actual thing I'd been turning over for a month, delivered without preamble. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I was counting exits, not watching you." I was counting exits, not watching you. I didn't know what that meant. I told her so. She stepped back from the door and let it swing wider, which I chose to interpret as an invitation, and I stepped inside. Her apartment was the kind of space that tells you something true about a person, without trying to. Not messy. The opposite of messy, actually, with a particular order that comes from someone knowing exactly where everything is and caring about it. But there was a thinness to the personalization, like she'd recently moved things around and hadn't quite finished deciding where they should go again. A bookshelf with 2 noticeable gaps. A nail in the wall where a picture used to hang. 2 plants on the windowsill, healthy, well-watered, which meant she was someone who paid attention, and a small folding table near the window she'd been sitting at, and on that table, a notebook. Open, pages covered in a neat, dense hand. I didn't read it. But I noticed it. She made tea without asking if I wanted it, set a cup in front of me, and sat down across the table. She said, "I've been writing down patterns. Who comes through the courtyard and when?" She looked at the notebook for a moment and then at me. "Someone has been coming into my apartment." I said, "What?" She said it the way people say things they've already survived the shock of, matter of fact, the way a doctor describes a diagnosis to themselves before they have to deliver it. She'd been keeping the notebook for 3 weeks. Times, neighbor movements. Who appeared to have a key to the building's secondary entrance. What was missing from her apartment? Small things, she said. Nothing that could be reported. Nothing that could be proven. Nothing that would survive a conversation with anyone official. Things that were designed to be unreportable. A notebook that had been on her desk. A phone charger. A photograph in a frame on the bookshelf, her and her sister in Portugal, 2 summers ago, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. It was gone. And it had been moved twice before it disappeared, relocated to a slightly wrong position on the shelf, close enough that you'd think you'd imagined it. She hadn't imagined it. She'd measured it. I said, "Who do you think is doing this?" She wrapped both hands around her cup. She said, "His name is Marcus. He's my ex. And then, after a pause, he's also, technically, my landlord." He took a notebook. Who steals a notebook? There are moments in a conversation when the architecture of a situation becomes visible all at once. Like someone turns on the lights in a room you thought you knew, and you see it's larger, and the doors you thought led somewhere don't. This was one of those moments. She told it carefully, the way you tell a story you've rehearsed, not because you're lying, but because the rehearsal is the only thing standing between you and the part that still costs too much to touch, unprepared. She and Marcus had been together for 2 years, engaged for 8 months of that. He was a property attorney, had been for a decade, specializing in residential leases and tenant law, which she said with a flatness that contained its entire own editorial. When they broke up, she'd stayed in the apartment. It was hers before him. He'd moved in and then, when it ended, moved out. It had felt, at the time, like a clean ending. 3 months after the breakup, a copy of her lease arrived in the mail. A new one. Amended, she'd gone through it line by line against the copy she'd signed, and found it. A clause buried in Section 7, subsection C, about unauthorized long-term occupancy of the unit. Her friend Daria had stayed with her for 2 weeks over the holidays. A year ago. Nothing unusual. A friend between apartments. According to this clause, that stay was a leasable offense, and the clause hadn't been in the original lease she'd signed. She knew that because she'd kept the original. He didn't know she'd kept it. I said, "Does he own this building?" She said, 50%. He has a silent partner, a man named Theo Baranowski, older, semi-retired, mostly hands-off. Marcus handles the management. I said, "Has he threatened you directly?" She said he hadn't needed to. He was the kind of person who didn't threaten, he arranged. He filed. He documented and built and waited. She said, "I know what gaslighting looks like. I lived there for 2 years. I know what gaslighting looks like." I lived there for 2 years. I looked at the notebook on the table between us. I asked if I could see it. She pushed it across without hesitation. I turned through it slowly. It was meticulous. Timestamps, dates. A small hand-drawn sketch of the courtyard with the main entrance, the secondary entrance, and the fire exit door on the east side, all marked. 31 days of observation. Times when she'd seen a particular neighbor. Times when the secondary entrance door, which should only open from a keycard or from inside, had swung open with no one apparently in the courtyard. 3 dates where small things in her apartment were wrong when she returned. Measured wrong, documented wrong, undeniable in the notation. She had been building a record. I said, "You weren't watching me." She said, "Not at first." And then she said, "But you always look up." Every morning. 31 days and you always look up. She said it simply, like a fact she'd logged. But something in the way she said it made me think it had been more than a data point. I want to stop here and tell you something about the kind of person Nadia was in those early hours, because it matters for everything that follows, and I think it would be easy to miss in the outline of events. She had been managing this alone for months, watching a person she'd once trusted as completely as you can trust anyone insert himself into the legal architecture of her daily life and begin, methodically, calmly, without visible anger, to take it apart. She'd watched her apartment be entered and her possessions be rearranged and removed in amounts small enough to be deniable. She'd received an amended legal document and understood immediately what it meant, not just as paperwork, but as a message. She'd had no one to tell who could help. And so she had opened a notebook. She had started counting exits. She had kept the original. These are not the actions of someone falling apart. They are the actions of someone who has decided, without announcing it, that the only available response to being made to feel crazy is to become more careful than the person trying to make her feel that way. I'd seen that quality before, in people I admired. I hadn't expected to find it in a conversation I'd walked into by knocking on a stranger's door on a Sunday morning. I also noticed that she hadn't asked me for anything. She'd let me in, told me the story, shown me the notebook. She had not asked me to fix it. I wasn't sure if that was dignity or training, the training of someone who'd learned not to ask, or both. I said, "I work with documents, source files, version histories, metadata. I know how to read where a digital file has been." She looked at me. She said, "The amended lease was emailed to me as a PDF." I said, "PDFs carry creation metadata. Edit timestamps. If he created that clause after you signed the original and formatted it to look like it had always been there, the file itself will say so. The document will tell the truth even if he won't." The quality of the silence changed, not heavy, lighter, actually the way air changes when a window is opened in a room that's been closed too long. She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "Most people don't. He may not know that you'd know who to ask." She looked at me for a long, considering moment. Then she said, "Why would you want to help me?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, "Because the courtyard is better with you in the window." She looked away. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. Something quieter. Something that hadn't decided yet whether it was safe. But she didn't say no. What followed was 3 days that moved the way days do when ordinary space has become charged. The corridor between our floors, the courtyard below, the timestamps on a folder she'd been afraid to examine too carefully. I went back to my apartment that first evening and looked up Marcus Hale on the State Bar's public directory. He was there, licensed for 11 years, no disciplinary record, a firm address in Midtown, reviews from former clients describing him as meticulous, detail-oriented. The kind of attorney who notices what other attorneys miss. The kind of person, in other words, who would know that a lease clause could be inserted into a formatted document without obvious telltale signs. If you were careful about the kerning and knew how Word handles paragraph spacing. The kind of person who had likely never been caught doing something like this before. Because the kind of person who does something like this chooses targets who don't know what to look for. He had chosen poorly this time. But he didn't know that yet. The next morning, I brought my laptop to her apartment. She made coffee instead of tea, which I noted without commenting on. We sat at the folding table near the window, and I walked her through what metadata analysis actually produces. Not a dramatic reveal, just a timestamp, just a creation date, just the invisible record that every digital file carries, whether or not its author wants it to. She watched me work the way she'd watched the courtyard, attentive, quiet, storing what she saw. At one point, she asked a technical question about how the metadata could be verified as unedited, whether it could be argued that I'd altered it, and I realized that she was already thinking like someone who expected to have to defend the evidence. She'd been living in that mode for a year. It had become her default. I told her about third-party verification, neutral forensic services that could produce a signed report from outside either of us. She wrote it down in the current notebook, not the courtyard one, a newer one, blue cover, already half full of the kind of documentation a person builds when they've accepted that they are, functionally, their own legal team. The second day, she let me look at the rest of what she'd compiled. Not just the notebook, a folder on her laptop with email screenshots, a photograph of the original lease next to a photograph of the amended version with the discrepancies circled in red pen. A voice memo she'd made to herself in November when she'd first received the new copy. Just her voice saying the date and reading the clause aloud and then saying, "This was not in what I signed. I know it wasn't. I have the copy." Her voice in that recording was steadier than I would have been. It was the voice of someone who had decided, in advance of crisis, to be a reliable witness to her own experience. She forwarded me the email containing the lease PDF. I pulled the metadata using a tool I use for checking client deliverables. Nothing specialized, something anyone could find with a web search, but something you'd only think to use if you knew documents lied in ways their words didn't. What came back was clean and specific and, in its cleanliness, completely damning. The PDF had been created on a date 14 months after Nadia had signed her lease. The signing date stamped on the document was a fabrication. The file hadn't existed on that date. It had been constructed in November on a Tuesday afternoon from a computer registered to a law firm address I searched and found immediately, Marcus Hale, attorney at law. Residential property. I told Nadia on Wednesday evening. She sat down in a chair in her kitchen and was very still. Then she said, "He really thought I wouldn't find out." I said, "He thought you wouldn't know who to ask." She said, quietly, more to herself than to me, "The lease clause didn't exist in June." I checked. The lease clause didn't exist in June. I checked. She had. The original she'd kept showed no clause in Section 7, subsection C. The gap where it would have sat was occupied by different language, in a slightly different font, a marginally different tapstop. The kind of thing invisible to a layperson and obvious to someone whose work is built on noticing exactly how a document is formatted. Between a designer's eye and a woman who had measured the placement of a photograph, we had what we needed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else." She went to her bedroom and came back with an old laptop, gray and scratched, not the machine she worked on daily, and set it on the kitchen table and opened it and turned the screen so I could see. A folder. Inside it, photographs. Photos of me crossing the courtyard, time stamped over the previous 2 weeks. Photos of Nadia at her window, taken from the courtyard below with a long lens, taken from the exact path I walked every morning, at times when I had been crossing it and had not seen anyone standing there with a camera. Her notebook pages, photographed, and at the end of the folder, a document titled Tenant Conduct and Harassment Complaint. Draft, not filed. A draft, but detailed, specific, professionally formatted. It claimed that Nadia had been surveilling other residents, creating a hostile environment, engaging in erratic and intimidating behavior. It named me as a potential witness. It named Gus. It named 2 other tenants I'd seen in the lobby and never spoken to. And at the bottom, a filing date. This Friday. It was Wednesday. Friday, 1 word. She said it like a verdict. 2 days. The eviction filing, the one built on the fraudulent lease clause, was already in motion. The harassment complaint was the second instrument. Even if the lease clause got challenged and failed, a formal harassment complaint filed with the building authority would follow her. It would attach to her rental history. It would reach her professional network. She was a freelance illustrator. Her reputation was her business, and Marcus knew exactly who her clients were because he'd watched her build that career for 2 years while they were together. The complaint didn't need to succeed. It needed to be filed. It needed to exist. And he'd sent her the folder. Deliberately, he'd emailed her a document titled Draft, so she would open it, read it, understand that it was coming, and make the calculation that leaving quietly was better than what was about to arrive publicly. He had been in her apartment taking a photograph. He had stood 40 feet below her window with a long lens and documented her watching the courtyard she had every right to watch from the apartment she had every right to live in, and he had shaped it into legal language and sent it to her as a threat in the language of information. She had kept the laptop in a drawer and kept making tea. I said, "The photographs in this folder have metadata too." She said, "I know." I said, "The timestamps on the courtyard photos, if he was down there with a lens at those times, he wasn't in your apartment. But 3 of these dates overlap with dates in your notebook where things went missing. Which means he wasn't working alone," she said. Daria. Her friend. The one whose 2-week holiday stay was now the mechanism of the lease violation. The one Nadia had made soup for when she was between apartments and let sleep in her bed and driven to the airport at 5 in the morning, because that's what you do for people you love. The silence after Nadia said that name was a different kind than any of the silences before it. I called in a favor. A woman named Keiko, someone I'd worked with at a previous studio who had moved into intellectual property law and knew more about digital evidence than anyone I'd met casually, and I described the situation in general terms and asked what the realistic options were given a 48-hour window. She said, "If the metadata on the fraudulent document can be verified by a neutral third party and the building's co-owner can be made aware of the legal liability before the filing lands, there are grounds to halt both instruments." She said, "No co-owner wants to be attached to fraud." A property attorney fabricating a lease document and filing a harassment complaint built on manufactured evidence. That's not a noise complaint. That's a professional conduct case. That's bar association territory. That's the kind of exposure a silent partner does not sign up for. She said, "Find the co-owner." It took 4 hours and a business registry search to find Theo Baranowski's email address, listed on a property investment group website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2019 and still had a photo of him from what must have been his 50s. I wrote the email carefully, not emotionally, not as a complaint, as a document. Timeline at the top. Metadata reports attached. Original lease versus amended lease side by side. Differences highlighted in a format a property investor could read in 3 minutes. What was provable stated as provable. What was demonstrable demonstrated. At the bottom, a note that the filings were scheduled for Friday morning and that he might want to review his exposure before that hour arrived. I sent it at 11 p.m. on Thursday. At 8 a.m. Friday, he'd read it. He called Marcus before he called me. I don't know exactly what was said in that call. I know it was short. I know Marcus had not told his co-owner about the amended lease clause. I know there are things a property attorney can do quietly, and there are things that once another partner learns of them and has them in writing, are no longer quiet. Whatever was said, it was enough. At 10:15 on Friday morning, Nadia's phone buzzed. She read the email from Marcus's firm standing at her kitchen counter. Withdrew, pending review. No further action. She set the phone down on the table and stood at the window for a long moment, looking down at the courtyard, at the birch trees fully leafed now, at the stone bench where she'd written half her notebook observations. I was standing in her kitchen. I said, "It's over." She said, "The harassment complaint." I said, "Keiko says it's unfiled and the metadata proves it was constructed on fabricated evidence. If he files it, he's filing fraud. He knows that now." She nodded. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Daria texted me this morning. She said she was sorry. She said Marcus had told her Nadia wanted to leave, but couldn't afford to break the lease, and that helping him document a pattern was just giving that process a push. He built a whole case against someone who just wouldn't leave quietly." I didn't say anything. She said she believed him. I know she actually believed him. That's the piece I can't put down. Not Marcus. I've known what Marcus is for a long time. You know, eventually, when someone's told you enough stories about other people that you start to see the pattern in who always ends up the problem in the story. I've known that for a year. It's Daria. It's the part where someone who genuinely loves you can be handed a version of events that fits neatly enough, that has just enough plausibility, that they choose the story over the question. She said, "He's very good at building a story." I said, "You were better at keeping the original." Something shifted in her face when I said that. Not a smile, she wasn't at smiles yet, that morning. Something older than a smile. A recognition. She said, quietly, "I wasn't furniture." Apparently he forgot that. I wasn't furniture. Apparently he forgot that. Here is what I want to tell you about the person she was in those 4 days, and in the 31 days before them, because I think it matters more than the sequence of events, and I think it would be easy to slide past it and the relief of an ending. She had been alone with this for months. She had watched someone she'd once loved insert himself, legally, literally, physically, into the architecture of her daily life, and begin, without visible anger, without a raised voice, to dismantle her right to stay in it. She'd watched her apartment be entered, and her belongings repositioned and removed, in amounts calibrated to stay beneath the threshold of what anyone would believe reported. She'd received an amended legal document and understood immediately what it was, not paperwork, but a message. She'd seen a friend recruited into it without understanding she was being recruited. She'd had no one with the right expertise, no obvious path forward, and no guarantee that anything she did would be enough. And her response to all of that was a notebook. An original lease in a drawer, a window she sat at every morning, because at least from there she could see what was actually happening. Not because she was fearless. because she had decided that the only way through being made to feel like she was misreading her own life was to document it with enough precision that she could trust her own record. When I asked her, later, what it had felt like to watch from the window through all of those weeks, to track exits and log timestamps and try to figure out from 30 feet up who had been coming through a door they shouldn't, she said, it felt like being competent when everything around you was working to make you feel small. She stopped. She said, I kept the notebook because I needed to know what I actually knew, separate from what Marcus was telling me I was supposed to know. Does that make sense? I said it did. Because it did. She said, the problem with someone who understands the law is they can make you doubt your own memory. Like maybe you signed something you don't remember signing. Like maybe the clause was always there and you just missed it. Like maybe Daria's 2 weeks counted as something legal and you simply never knew the rule. She paused. She looked at the window. The courtyard was quiet below, the Thursday morning light flat and kind on the birch leaves. She said, you always looked up. In 31 mornings, you always looked up. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely know what to do with it. I thought about all the reasons I'd looked up. The peripheral pull of being watched, the shape at the glass, the hand raised on a cold Saturday morning. The way a person can become a landmark in your day without your permission. I said, why did you watch the courtyard for a month? And she crossed the 3 feet of hallway between the table and where I was standing and kissed me, and her hands were shaking, and I understood then that the answer to the question was the question itself. That the watching had been a way of asking something she didn't yet know how to speak, and that she'd chosen, finally, to say it without words. I am not someone who handles surprise easily. I plan. I check metadata at 11 p.m. I draft emails carefully and then edit them twice. And here I was, in a third-floor apartment on a June morning, with no plan at all, with a woman whose hands were still shaking slightly and who had just answered 31 days of wondering with something that required no translation. She pulled back. She looked at me. She said, ask me again tomorrow. She's still that person. The careful one. The one who keeps the original and doesn't move until she trusts the ground. I said, I'll ask you tomorrow. She nodded. And something in her finally settled. Not relaxed, but settled, which is a different thing. The way a thing finds its level when it's been off balance long enough. That was 6 weeks ago. I am still asking her things. She is still, some mornings, measuring her answers, not from coldness, but from the careful habit of someone who learned that words have legal weight and should be chosen accordingly. We are still in the Kellner building, her on the 3rd floor, me on the 2nd, the courtyard between us every morning and every evening. Gus fixed the radiator without being reminded more than once, and the leak in 3F turned out to be minor and was resolved in an afternoon. She still has both notebooks. The old one sits on her shelf between 2 books, and sometimes when I'm at her table working, I notice it there and think about what it means to decide, in the middle of being systematically disbelieved, that the answer is to write everything down with greater precision. Marcus filed no harassment complaint. He withdrew from the building's management in May, voluntarily, on paper, though Theo Baranowski's attorney reportedly made clear that the alternative was messier. Theo found a new co-managing partner. Marcus has not contacted Nadia. His clients do not appear to have been told a story about her. Whether that's because Keiko's presence in the background made the risk clear, or because Theo's lawyer made certain things understood, I don't know. It doesn't matter. What matters is the silence, which is a different kind of silence than the kind she had been living inside. Daria sent a longer message eventually. A real one, not defensive. Nadia read it and waited 2 weeks before answering. She didn't tell me what she said, and I didn't ask. Some things belong entirely to the people they happen between, and I am still learning which ones those are. Because she is still teaching me, without calling it teaching, just by being the person she is. Precise, unhurried, watching the courtyard from a different kind of window now. Not counting exits, but seeing, I think, what was always there. What I know is this: she watched because someone had made her afraid, and she had decided that her response to fear was not to close the blinds, but to understand the situation with more precision than it could survive. She built a record. She kept the document. She let me help without surrendering the thread of what she already knew. And at the end of all of it, with the filing withdrawn, and the case collapsed, and the Friday morning opening into something ordinary again, she crossed a small hallway and answered a question with something better than words. I looked up. She was watching. That was, in the end, enough. Have you ever been seen by someone before you knew they were paying attention, and when you finally realized it, understood that they had been watching the version of you that was most real? The one that exists when no one's supposed to be looking. And have you ever stayed quiet about someone quietly dismantling your life? Not with loud cruelty, but with paperwork, with small removals, with a story told carefully to the people around you that made you look like the problem. Because what was happening left no marks anyone else could see. If you've been there, if you know what it means to keep the original when someone is telling you that you misread what you signed, write about it in the comments. I read every one, and if this story found you at the right moment, and you're new here, subscribe. There are more.